Hello and welcome. You're listening to WRFH, Radio Free Hillsdale 101.7 FM. I'm Malia Thibodeau, here today with Sam Raus, a Young Voices contributor who recently wrote an article for the American Thinker making the case that the U.S. should repeal its renewable fuel standard. Hi, Sam. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me on this afternoon.
Yeah. So first, tell me a little bit about yourself and then how you became interested in this topic.
Yeah, so I am the David Bowes Resident Writing Fellow at a group called Young Voices, which is an organization for young writers and political commentators. I particularly focus on issues around economics, around technology, and around promoting freedom and deregulation, open markets, and particularly have become very interested in the energy sphere, given its impact on our personal finances as Americans and how it touches so many different industries from, transportation to artificial intelligence to pretty much everything that powers our lives on a daily basis. And I think it's become particularly prevalent how expensive energy is and how much that is the fault of the government.
Mm-hmm. So this article was about the renewable fuel standard. Can you tell us what more about the history and its original purpose?
Yeah, so about 20 years ago, at the advent of the Bush administration, this renewable fuel standard was passed in a bipartisan manner, with particularly a lot of support among the environmentalist left, as we saw a big push towards new energy sources beyond traditional coal, fossil fuels, gasoline. And so what the renewable fuel standard does is it sets a baseline minimum amount that our transportation fuel supply, the oil and gas that we put into our cars, needs to include clean, quote unquote, clean energy sources, these green energies. And that particularly comes in the form of ethanol, which is essentially liquefied corn in its own way, like a corn as a gas fuel. And so when you are filling up your car's tank with gas, it's not pure gasoline. It's not just stuff that we drilled out of the earth or imported from abroad. It's also a mix of this corn fuel. And the problem with that, as nice as it sounds, as clean as it's supposed to be, although the science on that is rather iffy, is that these energy sources, they have different uses. The ethanol-based fuel is not as successful in terms of how well it powers the car, how much energy it provides, and it can be more expensive ultimately. It's not driven by market demand. So I want to use green energy because I want to be a green person, or I want to use the cheapest one because I don't have a lot of money. No, it's the government presetting what is available in the marketplace when we go to the gas station. And I think that's a lot of problems when we see the price of gasoline, the price of energy so important to our politics today.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that there's a balance to be struck between preserving natural resources and still growing the economy?
Yeah, and I think that can be done most successfully through the free market. I think we see when consumers demand something, markets respond. And so if people really don't want to be using so much single-use plastic, for example, and they start buying predominantly glass bottles, or they use water bottles more than prepackaged water bottles, we see shifts and we see people move towards different industries and offering new alternatives. And, I think a lot of things are sold now in aluminum cans or in glass, as opposed to plastic because of that. And that's just a small example, but I think you can balance it much better through seeing places where people have an interest in these things, and let the facts be laid out on the table, rather than when we have the government always intervene and try to predetermine, well, this is the greenest option. We don't let these companies innovate their way towards better options. And so we saw this, I think, most commonly with the electric vehicles. We try to kind of mandate them, both through regulation and through different subsidies, and push them on people, even though they were much more expensive and they're not as reliable. And so ultimately, that seems to have backfired because people are really upset with them. They're buying cars and they're not working in the way that they need to, and now we're seeing a decline in the electric vehicle industry. And so there's certainly a balance to be had when it comes to severe harms, when it comes to outright pollution and destruction of the planet. But when it comes to consumers' choices in the marketplace, we can't dictate that. The only thing we can dictate is what options are on the table.
Mm-hmm. So I do want to get back to the pollution question later, but I also want to ask, are there like other arguments for the renewable fuel standard that aren't just purely environmental?
I think that people saw ethanol as a very up and coming innovation. It was very new at the time. It was something that was seen as potentially much more effective as an energy source, right? We're talking about, how much do we burn for the amount of, in this case, for transportation, the mileage you're getting out of it, what kind of emissions that has, doesn't just affect the broader environment, but can affect the vehicle itself and the internal workings of the car. And so that was really used to kind of broaden the scope and make people that may have not been so favorable towards excessive environmental regulation be interested in moving forward with innovative technology. The problem is that since then, we found that this fuel source can really damage the car. It's really not that great for your car, and it causes for a lot more wear and tear than traditional gasoline. Over time, cars wear down, but this seems to accelerate that process, and it is not proven to have been better as a fuel source in terms of getting mileage out of it, in terms of getting more horsepower out of it, and so that case has also fallen. Beyond the environmental case, it really doesn't offer additional benefits that were originally promised to people. And that's not to say that it couldn't in the future if it was refined. These energy sources, it's about what we add to them, how we extract them, how they're used within the car's mechanics. But that should be a choice of people when they're picking, whether or not they want to fill it up with 87 or 95.
Mm-hmm. While I was researching, I did see a national security pro standard argument. Do you have any comment on that?
I'm not familiar with that. I think that the concern is about where we can source our energy from. And I'm just as concerned as anyone else with us being able to be not only self-reliant in terms of our energy needs, but dominant in terms of our energy needs, and really being able to provide not just the resources that we need to power the United States, but to be exporting energy to other countries rather than importing. And I think that's a huge priority of this administration. But I've not seen a clear argument that force feeding ethanol into our cars' gasoline is some sort of national security concern. And I think it's rather the opposite. I think it's not able to be effective and produced well enough and costly enough when we could be expanding drilling in this country. We could be really bolstering our gas industry that has been hindered under green regulations for the past 4 years under the Biden administration. I think that's really the step we need to be taking it. And rather than this, oh, well, we can do both things at the same time, really focusing down on a sector that we know will produce the power that we need if we unlock it.
Mm-hmm. You were talking about how America needs to get more into its own domestic production. So how does this standard affect the energy industry in the U.S.?
It's a clear case of corporate favoritism. It's propping up an energy source that they know most likely would not have the market demands to remain, widely purchased and distributed. Um, in contrast with traditional gasoline. And so if this were to be done away with, I think we would see, a rather dramatic shift towards people just wanting pure gasoline. And when consumers have a demand for something, the markets respond by providing the supply. And so I think this would need to come as we're seeing permitting reform occur, most likely this fall, to allow for some of the regulations that have prevented new drilling, prevented new resource extraction in the United States to occur, so that we can provide the energy that the people are demanding. But I think that this would see that industry really, really grow in a natural sense based off of what people actually want, rather than providing this kind. It's something of a subsidy in terms of mandating that this be included in our fuel supply, by mandating it, right? And so I think that we would see that without that favoritism, things would level out in the way that reality really is.
Yeah, I've seen a bit of rhetoric about how the standard actually raises prices in other industries,
Absolutely.
especially like the agricultural and with like you were talking about how ethanol is made from corn. Could you speak on how it affects farmers and such?
Yeah, so obviously we all kind of know in this country we produce a lot of corn. It's one of our greatest agricultural industry sectors. What we see with the production of ethanol is that farmers begin to mass produce this singular crop, that being corn, year over year, which we know has bad effects on the earth and the dirt that it's growing in, and it makes the soil not as fertile in the long run. And then, they rely on mass production of this for the energy source, for the energy industries, and not for feeding Americans. And they're not growing other crops to feed Americans that may be in more demand, because they're kind of get siloed into this sector in a way. I'm not a particular expert in the agricultural industry, but I think what we know is that people are not able to be flexible and adaptive in their business when there are so many regulations and preset standards telling them how to do it. And so I can only imagine that the farmers in this country probably need to alter their strategy, what they're growing, what they're trying to sell, where they're selling it to, on an annual basis, based off of what people are consuming, what people are looking for. Diets change, people's interests change, certain crops have a bad year. And I think that setting standards like this definitely warps what they see as the market's demand, not by actually changing people's opinions, but by sending a signal from the government of what they want to be produced and sold. And that, I think, impacts their ability to be resilient and an ability to function as business people at the end of the day.
Right. And that probably also harms the environment as well. Like you were talking about how they don't do crop rotation and such. So,
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's a great example of when government intervention, really, to protect the environment, can have a lot of unintended consequences and backfire at its original goal.
mm-hmm. This is WRFH Radio Free Hillsdale 101.7 FM. If you're just tuning in, I'm Malia Thibodeau with Sam Rouse, a Young Voices contributor and political analyst who studies consumer choice and tech policy. So, in a wider scope, you did mention the Biden administration briefly. Could you talk about how they prioritize the standard and the consequences of that?
Yeah, the Biden administration, really tried to intervene in the free market when it came to not just green energy, but environmental policy more broadly, trying to push ESG mandates, trying to, really clamp down on traditional fossil fuels, refusing to approve the Keystone XL pipeline, shutting down a lot of other projects in Alaska. The list kind of goes on and on. And so they really embodied this, what you would call a Green New Deal spirit, I guess, of the government will decide how businesses and the marketplace functions with this big overarching environmental goal. But the problem with it was always very heavily focused on these concerns with carbon emissions, these concerns with temperatures rising. That's really been prevalent over the entire climate change movement, and not at the specific impact that certain policies or certain businesses could have on America's environment, the actual forests, the actual rivers, the actual people in this country, and the natural wildlife around them. And it really, it set these big picture goals, which I think is the same thing we see with the renewable fuel standard. Oh, we want people's transportation fuel to not be so environmentally harmful. And let's work backwards from that rather than looking at specific instances of, oh, wow, okay, we can't put this into the water because of what it does to water. That's really science-based, not market-based. And I think that what we're seeing is getting back to real conservation. And there's a huge movement among people on the right that are interested in conservation, but in terms of actually protecting our national parks, in terms of focusing on the species, that the endangered species that people are very concerned about, rather than these kind of abstract goals that kind of forget about the science of some of these resources at the end of the day, in all honesty.
Right. So the new administration's EPA, from what I've understood, has been keen to repeal some environmental regulations on businesses. But the newest publication that I've seen raises the standard, the level for the renewable fuel standard. Is this some sort of internal contradiction?
I think that there's a lot of interests in protecting the existing powers that be in the agricultural sector. And I think that any regulation or subsidy that has a clear instance of favoritism over competitors within a marketplace, in this case, it would be the energy companies, and it'd be favoring those that produce ethanol over the traditional fossil fuels. There's very strong lobbying interest behind that. There's very strong influence that these groups can develop over time that entrenches these rules, and they're rather difficult to get rid of. So I don't know if it's a contradiction by the administration or something that they're particularly aware of, but more of these suppliers have been seen as an ally and a part of the broader energy industry for years. And so continuing that policy is just kind of something that doesn't really get much second guessing just yet.
So following that, we know that your ideal is if they repeal the standard altogether. But what do you think is something that you could see them in Washington doing that might be at least toward this goal? And how do you think that they would accomplish it?
Yeah, I can imagine there's certainly people that have interest in my recommendation of a full repeal. I think, like we saw with some of the Inflation Reduction Act subsidies for solar and wind energy, is a phase-out strategy that would slowly wind down this policy, essentially reducing the numbers year over year for the next few years as the administration wraps up, most likely. That I'm not sure. I can't politically prognosticate about this very well. I think we're in a very different moment than when the IRA subsidies were ended with the One Big Beautiful Bill. That was, right before the 4th of July. The administration was really on a high. I think after everything that's happened this week, obviously the administration is kind of in a challenging spot. I think that the second reconciliation bill is probably in a challenging spot right now. And so where we go with this, I think I would hope for a phase out would be contemplated very heavily. But yeah, I think it's hard to say when we don't really see much public conversation going around this just yet.
Right. Before we wrap up, where can people follow your work?
Yeah, you can follow me on X at Sam Raus1, that's RAUS, and check out Young Voices for more content by me and various other contributors in our program.
Yeah, thank you for joining me today, Sam. I'm Malia Thibodeau, and you've been listening to WRFH, Radio Free Hillsdale 101.7 FM.